Hello, welcome to Working with Miniatures. I'm Jim, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I've been meaning to go back and look at all the old miniatures I've painted so I can compare them to what I did this year. We'll be doing this in multiple phases. So the first phase will be everything I painted from 1999 and older. The second phase will be everything I painted in 2018. And the third phase will be everything I painted in 2021 in preparation for starting this YouTube channel. I'll do everything I painted this year in a separate video that will be coming up later this week. Let's get started. Many of these miniatures came from the HeroQuest board game. Others came from Ral Partho or Reaper Miniatures, to name some of the manufacturers. All of these were painted with cheap craft paint and using really cheap brushes from Walmart. One of the bigger problems I know I had back then was I didn't really thin the paints down. I used them straight out of the cap, which more often than not led to a very chalky or extremely heavy finish. These last few came out the best out of all the ones I painted in 1999 and before. The best miniatures I painted during this time period, in my opinion, is the Fire Elemental, which I struggled to paint with fire, so somehow I made this low quality miniature look decent. And then there's the Orc. This was actually the last miniature I painted in 1999. I don't know how I got the skin to look this decent using craft paint. And then the two absolute best I believe I painted during this time period was a rat whose molding allowed dry brushing to really bring out the details, and Anubis whose headdress I remember being very happy with. The absolute worst miniatures I painted during this time period, in my opinion, is the giant whose toga I apparently decided not to finish, and the ranger on the far right who offends my senses. I don't know why this thing reminds me of a Simpsons character. And the absolute worst is the hippie disco Jesus wizard on the far right. That thing's just god-awful. In summation, I painted roughly 80 miniatures around this era, and I'm sure I've lost or given a few away over the years, but this is likely pretty accurate. In the end, there are only a few that do not offend my senses when I look at them now. Some of these are pretty bad. I would also like to add a few of these, such as the man in the white cape, the man in the red suit, and the woman in the purple dress with the staff, to name a few. I did not judge as harshly as I probably should. This is based on the fact that I know I repainted these multiple times, and the many layers of craft paint is now obscuring much of the miniature's details. Most of the miniatures I painted in 2018 were from the tabletop game called Guild Ball. The butchers were painted first with literally decades old craft paint, the same craft paint used to paint all the miniatures that were shown previously. The clear winner here is the dog. Honorable mentions are the face of the female with red hair and the blood on the cleaver held by he who appears to be Nappa from Dragon Ball Z. From the Morticians, a clear winner is the guy on the left. I remember not really wanting to paint him, but dry brushing worked very well on his sculpt, and that was the only technique I knew at that time other than basic base coating. Honorable mentions are the feathers on the spear from the man on the right and the highlight on the staff's gem held by the woman in the middle. I really like her sculpt, as she reminds me of Morticia from the Addams Family, that blank, uncaring look on her face and the pose of her crooked arm. The Horton plane is from the Dust Tactics and Dust 1947 game. It came out okay. The white dabs on the wings were my poor attempt to imitate the box art. I wouldn't paint another miniature at all, let alone from dust, for another 3 years. In summation, a lot of the paint on these are very chalky, and I needed to thin it with more water and probably shake the bottles a lot more than I did. I only painted 11 miniatures in 2018, but even the worst of this era is far better than the vast majority of what I painted in 1999 and before. The top left unit was the first miniatures I painted with the Army Painter Mega Paint set, and was the first true miniature paint that I've really used. I still wasn't really thinning the paint at all other than a little water. Also, I chose not to dry brush any of these, trying to focus on learning how to paint by layers. The power armor on all the models on the right and the woman on the bottom left were awful. Her face also looks like a blow-up doll. The man in the middle on the bottom left came out decent. I was experimenting with camo patterns, and oddly enough, his face looks a bit like Viggo Mortensen. For the gorillas in the top left, I did ultimately break down and dry brush their fur, but they're really nothing special to write home about. The unit in the top right were kind of fun to paint. They were zombie suicide bombers. And the other only thing to really note is the snipers in the bottom left corner. I tried to do some urban camouflage even though these units are from World War II. I thought I'd still try it anyway, and they came out pretty decent. For some of the pieces on these miniatures, I started experimenting mixing metallic paint with colored paint, such as the Jaws of Life on the miniature in the very bottom left corner, or the bazooka towards the bottom right. I also wanted to point out I did not hand paint or use transfers for any of the hammer and sickles or the medic emblem on the bag. These were already on the miniatures from the manufacturer. I just carefully painted around them. For a lot of these miniatures, I tried painting them the same green to kind of unify them as they were all part of the same army. I did start feeling a little discouraged as I realized this last batch started looking a little worse than what I started with. I kind of realized around this point that I was just pumping them out as fast as I can, as opposed to trying to really learn how to paint better. The woman in red in the bottom right was probably my best miniature up to this point. She was the first one that I actually fully completed the eyes, as if you look closely at all the other ones before this, their eyes were just solid black with tiny little pinpricks of white in the center. For the miniatures across the top, I continued experimenting with different camo patterns. For the miniatures across the top, I continued experimenting with various camo patterns, with the top right ones being camouflage paint on the skin itself. The bottom left miniatures were painted to kind of represent and pay homage to the 92nd Infantry from the U.S. Army that served during World War I and World War II. For this batch of units, I went way off the beaten path and painted them up as if they were the agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. from the old Marvel Comics. This idea stemmed from the commander having a cigar and eye patch, which reminded me of Nick Fury, the old school Nick Fury that looked like David Hasselhoff. I do want to point out that the white armor is pretty terrible. It's chalky and the highlights are barely noticeable. And of course you can't have the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. without the Avengers. Again, I want to point out that the stars on their chest are not transfers, and I didn't hand paint them either. They were already on the miniatures. I just carefully painted around them. I really enjoyed painting these like this, as it was an added challenge and it was something fun to do, and I felt like I was thinking out of the box at the time. The man on the left I remember putting a lot of time and effort into, especially his face. He's the main commander for the US Army, and if he's going to be over the Avengers, he has to be someone special, so I patterned him after Duke from the G.I. Joe cartoons and comics. The woman on the right I had modified by cutting her index finger off, that way it looks like she's giving you the bird. I remember trying pretty hard to make her shirt pretty dingy, as if she had sweated through it. Her face doesn't look great, but her pants do, even though they don't match the dinginess of her shirt. These didn't come out great, but I remember putting a lot of effort and time into these because I was trying to airbrush the colors and learn how to use zenithal highlighting. Instead of using thin paints, I was using Army Painter paint straight out of the bottle, and of course I spent more time unclogging the airbrush than I did airbrushing anything. These 6 miniatures are the last ones that I painted in 2021. The man in the spacesuit with the rifle on the left is easily the worst one I painted that year, and then part of it's because the sculpt itself is just so bad. This is the white polymer from Reaper Miniatures, and I'm just not a fan of those. The woman on the far right is easily the best one that I painted that year. I spent a lot of time on coming up with paint mixture to make Olive's skin, and I used blue to highlight the black hair as opposed to gray as I had done before. I also did a pretty good job on her eyes. It's going to wrap it up for today. I hope you enjoyed laughing at some of the terrible things I painted in the past. I have come a long way, to be fair, and I'm doing a lot better this year. I still have a lot to learn and a lot more practice to go. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I hope to see you again soon. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time. I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video.